This week's parsha, we have a little section which is relevant in practice today, that was not said by Moshe Rabbeinu. It was said by Eliezer. When the soldiers came back from the war with Midian, and they came back with metal vessels, so Eliezer gave them the halachas of hechsher kelim, how to kasher kelim that were used for food that's forbidden, and tfilas kelim, and being toivel kelim that were acquired from a Gentile. And the pasuk says, achas hazav es hakosef, gold and silver, es mecheshes, copper, es habarzel, iron, es habedil, tin, v'es ha'efares, and lead, meaning metal vessels. So the halach is as follows: Kol davar asher yavo bo'eish, whatever is used with fire, ta'aviru bo'eish v'toher, you shall put through the fire and purify it. And Rashi explains that the type of fire you use depends on how the kli was used. If the kli was used over fire, such as a skewer for roasting, then you kasher it with libun. You kasher it by placing it in fire until it becomes glowing. If it was used with hot water, let's say it's a pot in which you boiled isser in water, then you kasher it that way. But Rashi understands that both are included in this pasuk of taviru bo'esh, put it through fire. You put it through the same type of fire that was used with the isser. V'toher, and you purify it. Now this v'toher, the Gemara says in Breitowitz, is a ribui. Comes to be marba that there's a second purification, which is tvila. You have to be toivel the vessel. It's not enough to kasher the vessel to remove the forbidden substance. You have to be toivel the vessel to be acquired from the Gentile. And in what type of mikveh do you have to be toivel? Ach b'mei nida yischata. But it should be purified in mei nida. And the Gemara says mei nida means the type of water that a woman who is in nida can be toivel in. It has to be a mikveh of 40 sa. And then it says v'chol asher lo yavo bo'esh, whatever is not used with fire, ta'aviru v'moyin, you put through water. Now there's a machlekes Rashi and the Ramban what this means. Rashi says that this is the source for being toivel kelim that don't need hechsher. Let's say you have a kli which doesn't need to be kashered, because it wasn't used with hot, it was used only with cold, so you don't need to kasher it. So who told you that such a kli needs tevila? So that's this pasuk, called asher lo yavo bo'esh taviru b'mayim. Whatever you don't use with fire, you put through the mikveh. The Ramban says no, the taviru b'mayim is not mashma tefillah. The Ramban says this refers to washing the kli out well. That anything which is not used with hot, so the walls of the kli don't absorb, but you still have the sticky residue on the kli. So taviru b'mayim is to rinse it, to wash it well. How do I know such kelim require tefillah? So the Ramban says it's a svara. Because once you kasher a kli that was used with hot, there's also no absorbed food, and still you have to be toivel. So therefore, a kli that was used with cold, you also have to be toivel. There's no difference. If I don't need a pasuk to be marba, this requires tefillah. So this is the source of the halacha of hechsher kelim, how you kasher a kli. That's in the part of the pasuk which says, Kol davar asher yavo bo'esh, taviru bo'esh. And then there's the halach of tfilas kelim, which comes from v'toher, that after you kasher the kli, you still need a tefillah. What is the purpose of this tefillah? So the Rishonim Masechtas Avodah say that the purpose of this tefillah is when the keli leaves the reshus Eved Kechavim and enters the reshus of Yisrael, it requires tefillah. Now, by analogy, the same way that when a person is mizgayer, so he goes from being a Gentile to being a Jew. So part of that process involves tefillah. So the kli, when it moves from the domain of the Gentile to the domain of the Jew, it also requires tefillah. There are other Rishonim, and Rashi and Chumash is also mashma this way, holds that the tefillah is part of the process of hechsher. Is part of the process of kashering the kli, is that it requires tefillah. So the question is asked, how can that be? As we know that even kelim chadashim require tefillah. So it can't be that the purpose of the tefillah is part of the kashering process. I'll just mention a very, very interesting idea. There's a very nice sefer on Tfilas Kelim, a whole sefer on Tfilas Kelim called Tfilas Kelim. And in the Hagdama, he brings from a sefer, Divrei Shaul, I never heard of, which says that there's a machlekes rishonim whether Tfilas Kelim is daraisa or derabbanan. Meaning, are these real drushes or are these drushes only in asmachta? So the Divrei Shaul makes a pshara. He says that a kli which was used with treif and absorbed and required hechsher, there the tzvila is daraisa. The tzvila of kelim chadashim, of new kelim, is only midrabanan. And therefore Rashi says is correct. In other words, the purpose of the tzvila is part of the process of kashering. You have to kasher kelim chadashim, that's only midrabanan. But the tefillas kelim, which is daraisa, is of kelim that were kasher. However, like the Rishonim, the paskin, that even tefillah of kelim chadashim is daraisa, in Nevada you can't learn that the purpose of the tefillah is part of the process of kashering, because even new kelim require tefillah. It must be, again, as we said, because when it moves from the reshus of the Ovid Kechavah to the reshus of Yisrael, it requires tefillah. So this little parsha of hechsher kelim and tefillas kelim was said by Eliezer HaKayin. Why wasn't it said by Moshe Rabbeinu? So Rashi quotes the Chazal. Immediately before this parsha, it says that when the soldiers returned from the Milchama against Midian, it says, Vayiktzov Moshe al Pekudei Achoyel, that Moshe got angry at the soldiers. Why he got angry, we'll see. It's a complicated story. But he got angry at the soldiers. They had done something wrong. And the Gemara says that when a person is ba lechlal kas, ba lechlal tos, a person gets angry, a person can make mistakes. And Rashi mentions that we know that this had happened on other occasions to Moshe Rabbeinu. Rashi mentions by the Shmini Limiluim, when he became angry at the Eliezer and the Isamar for not eating the Soar Chatzos of Rosh Chodesh, he had made a mistake. And likewise, by the name Riva, when he got angry and said Shimuna Hamayrim, he made a mistake and he hit the rack instead of speaking to the rack. And this is the third example. When he got angry at the Pekudei Achayo, he was bo lechlal tos, and he forgot this halacha of hechsher kelim, and therefore it had to be said by Eliezer HaKayin. Eliezer HaKayin, to his credit, said it in the name of Moshe Rabbeinu. He said, Zos chukas haTorah asher tziva Hashem es Moshe. This is the law that Hashem said to Moshe. In other words, Moshe only temporarily forgot it, but really was given to him. Therefore, Eliezer gave credit where credit is due. He didn't say it in his own name, he said it in Moshe Rabbeinu's name. This is the law that Hashem said to Moshe. The question is, of all the things that Moshe Rabbeinu could forget, why was it just this halacha of Gilui Nachem? What is the significance of this halacha of Hechsher Kelim? This is the halacha. He got angry, and this is the halacha he forgot. I guess we could also discuss this in the other two instances, but we're learning this week's parsha. So let's understand what was the anger of Moshe Rabbeinu, and why did it result in forgetting just this halacha of Hechsher Kelim? The truth is, there is a fascinating difference of opinion as to actually when Moshe Rabbeinu got angry. Anybody who reads the Psukim Kipshutam will come to the conclusion that the Ramban comes to, that the reason he got angry is because they came back with the women instead of killing them. But it says in the pasuk, "Vayetzu Moshe ve'Eliezer HaKohen v'chol Nasiei ha'edel lekrosam," that Moshe and Eliezer HaKohen and all the Nasiim went out to greet the returning soldiers. El michutz l'machaneh. They went outside of the camp to greet the returning soldiers. Vayiktzov Moshe al pekudei hachoyel. And Moshe Rabbeinu got angry at the commanders of the army, Sari ha'alafim, Sari ha'meos, the overseers of the thousands, the overseers of the hundreds, Haboyim mitzvaham l'chama, who came back from battle. V'yomer alei Moshe, and Moshe said to them, Hachayisam kol nekeva, did you let all the women live? You spared the women? And Moshe Rabbeinu explains that they were the ones who were machshil, the Bnei Yisrael. They caused the Bnei Yisrael to stumble. This is why we went out to war against Midian in the first place. So how could you spare the women? And therefore he told them, now you should go and kill them. So the Ramban speaks out that this is why Moshe Rabbeinu got angry. He got angry because they spared the women. Did Moshe Rabbeinu ever tell them to kill the women? No, he never did. Right? When he sent them out to war, he just said, take revenge against Midian. So why should he get angry? It's not like they violated an explicit command. So the Ramban says they should have understood. If the whole war against Midian is to take revenge for their having been machshel the Bnei Yisrael and Shittim, they sent their daughters out to seduce the Jewish men. So it goes without saying, if you're taking revenge, that certainly should be the target of your revenge. So therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu felt it wasn't even necessary to speak it out. It should have been self-evident that you have to kill the women. So when they came back with the women, that's when Moshe Rabbeinu got angry. That's the Ramban understands, and that's the Pshuto Shel Mikra. The Gemara in Shabbos, at least the way Rashi learns the Gemara, has a totally different pshat when Moshe Rabbeinu got angry. It's mamash of Dover Pella. For this, we have to see a little bit of the structure of the parsha. After we have this story of the Bekudei Achayel coming back with the women, and Moshe Rabbeinu telling him to kill the women, and Eliezer HaKohen gives the parsha of Hechsher Kalim, we have another very, very long parsha about what was done with the spoils of the war. An extremely, extremely long parsha. And once we spoke about it at length, what the significance of this parsha is, and an exact counting of how many sheep were captured, and how many donkeys were captured, and how many servants were captured, and there were 2 taxes, one for the Kehanim, a fantastically long parsha. At the end of that parsha, it says that the commanders of the army came to Moshe Rabbeinu, and they said, we counted all the heads, we counted all the soldiers, v'lo nifgad mimenu ish, and we're not missing a single person. And we're coming to bring a carbon. We're coming to bring a carbon, a special gift, a special offering. What is the special offering? So the Gemara says that each soldier, if he came across a golden vessel, a bracelet or a ring or an earring, ogil, the chumas, various ornaments, so each soldier gave a contribution of that golden ornament, l'chaper al nafshe seinu, as an atonement. So Moshe and Eliezer HaKohen took this gold, and it was measured, and it was contributed to the Mishkan. Rashi says, what was the purpose of this kapara? It says the soldiers were a kapara. So Rashi quotes the Gemara in Shabbos very, very briefly. Just the last line of the Gemara, that it was l'chaper al hirur halev shel benos Midian. This was a kapara to be mechaper for illicit thoughts. They went to Midian, they waged war. Undoubtedly, the daughters of Midian were on display again. So, of course, no one did anything. No one, chas v'shalom, committed an aveira. But maybe they might have looked at them and they might have had an illicit thought, and therefore they felt it necessary to bring a kapara, and they each gave a golden ornament, a ring, a bracelet, etc., to the Mishkan, and this was their kapara. Now Rashi again quotes one line from the Gemara. But if you look in the Gemara in Shabbos, and the Gemara tells the whole story, the Gemara goes like this. It starts with the pasuk, way back at the beginning of the story. Vayiktzov Moshe al Pekudei Achoyel. That Moshe Rabbeinu got angry at the soldiers. Amr Rav Nachman, Amr Rabbi Bar Avua, Amr Lehem Moshe Yisrael. Moshe said to the Yisrael, Shema chazartem lekilkulchem harisha. Perhaps you went back to your original sin. Maybe you went back to the original sin. That's why he was angry. So Rashi says that what was Moshe Rabbeinu accusing them? Moshe Rabbeinu suspected that when they went to Midian, it must be they did terrible things. It must be that they consorted with the Benos Midian again, because they came back and they wanted to bring a carbon. That's what Rashi says. Look, kulchem shel ma'aseh shitim. Perhaps he went back to the kilkul of ma'aseh shitim. Liz nice al Benos Mayav. Shema kach asisim b'Midian. Perhaps that's what you did in Midian. Lekachtem tzrichen carbon, and that's why you need the carbon. Now the Marsha asks in Rashi that at this point in the story there is no mention of them bringing a carbon. That fact that they brought a carbon is only mentioned way later in the parsha, 50 psukim later in the parsha, after they counted the spoils and divided the spoils and gave the mechas to the kohen. Then it says they came and they wanted to bring a carbon. But the Gemara is referring to the pasuk in the beginning of the parsha of Vayiktzov Moshe al Pekudei Achoyel. The Moshe got angry, and Rashi says, why did he get angry? He got angry because he saw they were bringing a carbon. So he jumped to the conclusion that it must be because they conducted themselves immorally when they went to Midian. So the Marsha is puzzled, right? Where does it say they brought a carbon? Well, the answer is very simple. The answer is Moshe saw they brought a carbon. We only have the script. We don't have the video. There was Mistama, they came with their carbon. And Moshe Rabbeinu assumed, why are they bringing a carbon? They're bringing a carbon because they must have been Mizana when they were in Midian. So he got angry. In other words, according to the Gemara, at least the way Rashi learns, Moshe Rabbeinu's anger had nothing to do with the fact that they did not kill the women. The reason he was angry is because when he saw that they brought a carbon, he assumed they must have been Mizana. And the whole issue of whether they killed the women, spared the women, that's tangential. In other words, the Torah doesn't tell us what the consequence of Moshe Rabbeinu's anger was until way later, as we'll see in a moment. But Moshe got angry because he thought that when they were in Midian, they were Mizana. And Moshe doesn't act on his anger, doesn't do anything with his anger. But then he just goes to a different subject. He spared the women. He shouldn't have spared the women. He wasn't angry about that, again, because he never told them to kill the women. So he tells them not to kill the women, and then they get a little bit sidetracked with the counting of the spoils, and then we get back on track at the end of the story, right? The commanders come back and they say, "Lo nitgad minu ish," not a single man is missing. And the Gemara in Shabbos says that means that not a single man has departed from the Jewish way. In other words, you're accusing people of being mizana. Well, listen, we can't give you an answer right away because we don't know. There might have been some that did. So they went and they checked, they clarified, and they said, "Lo nitgad mimenu ish." Not a single person departed from the Jewish way. So on that, Moshe then asks, "Im ken kapara lama." So why are you bringing the carbon? So why are you bringing the carbon? So they answered, "Amarlo, im midei aver yatzanu, midei hiur lo yatzanu." Just because we didn't do any averis doesn't mean we're totally innocent. We may have been nichshal in a hiur aver, an illicit thought. And therefore, miyad v'nakriv is carbon Hashem. They brought the carbon. So it comes out like this, that we have a very interesting machlokes between the Ramban and how Rashi learns Pshat in the Gemara as to what Moshe was angry about. The Ramban understands the Psukim Kipshutam, that Moshe was angry because they made a mistake. They should have figured out on their own they're supposed to kill the women. They didn't. Moshe was angry. Why do you get angry about a person who makes a mistake? Everyone makes mistakes. So of course we know the Mishnah Pirkei Avos that says Shigagas Talmud Oila Zot. That if you make an error in learning, it's considered a deliberate sin because you have to take Torah seriously. You have to take mitzvah seriously. Right? You're not supposed to make mistakes. So if a person makes a mistake, it's considered a deliberate sin. So therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu got angry because they made a mistake. That's how the Ramban understands, and that's what the Pshut Shemikra. Anybody reading the Psukim would come to that conclusion. The Rashi, the way he understands the Gemara, holds that the fact they spared the women has nothing to do with Moshe Rabbeinu's anger. And in fact, the issue of Moshe Rabbeinu's anger is a pasuk in the beginning of the parsha, and the subject is taken up 60 psukim later at the end of the parsha. He was angry because when he saw they came with a carbon with these golden ornaments to bring as an offering, he assumed they must have done a terrible aveira. And they said, no, chas v'sholom, no one ever did a terrible aveira. So why did you bring the carbon? Because of hiur aveira. Hiur aveira. So Moshe accepted the carbon. It comes out like Rashi's pshat. It's Moshe Rabbeinu who made the mistake, not them who made the mistake. Like the Ramban, they made the mistake. Right? They were supposed to kill the women, they didn't. According to Rashi's pshat, Moshe Rabbeinu made the mistake. Moshe Rabbeinu suspected them of committing a terrible aveira. The proof is they're bringing a carbon. And the reality, no, they were bringing a carbon for a very, very small thing. Maybe chas v'shalom, they were nichshal in the hiur aveira. Why did Moshe Rabbeinu make that mistake? Why did Moshe Rabbeinu make that mistake? The answer is very simple. Let's say a person would come to me and say, I need to talk to you. I feel very, very guilty. And I really need a tikkun. I need advice how to do tshuva, and so on and so forth. Well, what conclusion would I jump to before hearing the entire story? Like, what type of aveir would I assume the person must have done? Well, it depends on the person. But if the person is a person who's mamashet tzaddik yisod ha'olam, he's medaktik b'kalak chamura, so if he comes to me and says he needs a kapara, I might assume, well, he might have done a small thing, right? But if the person is a regular guy, not so scrupulous, not so learned, not such a great Yirei Shemayim, and he comes to me and he says, I need a big tikkun, I did something terrible, so I would jump to the conclusion he must have done, who knows what he did, an unimaginably terrible sin. When Moshe Rabbeinu spoke to these people, the Pekudei Achayil, and he sees they're coming with a carbon, Moshe Rabbeinu underestimated their madrega. He didn't assume that they would be so guilt-ridden and they would come with this kapara, this golden kapara, because maybe they committed a hiur aveir. Maybe they had a thought of an aveir. He assumed they must have done something really awful. So he got angry, rightfully so. He got angry. If you did something awful, you deserve Moshe Rabbeinu's anger. Right? And they said, no, chas v'sholom. Says, an aveir like that, unimaginable. Says, no, a hiur aveir. Maybe someone looked and thought an illicit thought, and that's how to bring a kapara. But we understand why Moshe made the toast. The toast is because he underestimated the darga, the spiritual darga of these Yidden who went to war. Right? He assumed that if they're coming with a kapara, it must be they really did something awful. Right? If they're guilt-ridden, and they're bringing kaparas, it must be they did a terrible aveira. The reality wasn't that. The reality was what they did was an aveira kala. It was a hiur aveira, which is not a small thing, of course. A hiur, a thought. But they were on the madrega where even for a hiur they felt they needed a kapara. And Moshe Rabbeinu totally underestimated where they were holding. Why did he forget the parsha of Hechsher Kelim? Because that really is the lesson of the Parsha of Hechsher Kalim. The Torah says don't eat treif, don't eat chazer, don't eat nevela. Right? So okay, nevela I won't eat. Chazer I won't eat. It says the taste that's absorbed in the wall of a kli, that should be a problem because it might contaminate my food. That seems a little far-fetched. I mean, I have to worry about that too? Is that something that the Rebbeinu Shalom expects of me? Okay, treif I won't eat, ham I won't eat, pork I won't eat, nevela I won't eat. Good. But the tam that's absorbed in a kli, the taste which is absorbed in a kli, and I cook my potatoes in that same kli and it has that taste, that is something that Rebbeinu Shalom expects of me? The answer is yes. Right? Because the Yidden are a lofty people, are a holy people. And the HaKadosh Baruch Hu can make such demands of a holy people. But Moshe Rabbeinu, since he underestimated them, and he held that such a thing that a person shouldn't even have a hiur aveira, is not something which a person could expect of himself. It's not even something that a HaKadosh Baruch Hu could expect of a person. So Mida Kneged Mida, what halacha did he forget? He forgot this halacha of Hechsher Kalim. This halacha of Hechsher Kalim shows how great a Yid can be. That a HaKadosh Baruch Hu can demand of him not just to avoid eating something which is mamish treif, but even the tam, which is belua and the kli, even that a HaKadosh Baruch Hu could demand of us. That shows how lofty a Yid is, because the HaKadosh Baruch Hu can make such demands of us. That Moshe Rabbeinu forgot, Mida Keneged Mida, because he underestimated the Madrega of Yidden. So such a halacha, he forgot it. He wasn't shaykh to this halacha. Because as Moshe Rabbeinu understood their Madrega, this was not an expectation that would have been reasonable to expect of people, that they should be nizar in the bliya of a kli. So that's why, of all things that he forgot, it's just this halacha that he forgot. Perhaps that's a possibility. I want to point out that the connection of Hechsher Kalim to the whole parsha of the Milchemes Midyan and the whole question of hiur aveira is really much deeper. There's a much deeper connection over here. First, let's understand a very interesting thing about this halach of Hechsher Kalim. As we said, let's go with the mainstream Rishonim that hold that the whole din of Hechsher Kalim is because since the Kli left the Rishus of the Eved Kechavim and entered the Rishus of the Yisrael, now it requires tefillah, it requires sanctification, because it's going from not being holy to being in a holy Rishus. But the problem is this: there are two very peculiar halachas that apply to tefillas kalim. Number one, only applies to metal kalim. That's what it says. Achas hazov, sakesef, necheshes, barzel, bedil, iferes, only metal kalim. That's agav that also mentioned. That's interesting. That what about metals that aren't listed over here? Does aluminum require tefillah daraisa? B'shayla and paiskim. In other words, we lump aluminum with other metals, but maybe the term natchais only applies to the 6 metals that the term mentions. Interesting shayla. But al kaponim, it only applies to kli matchais, to metal vessels, not to wooden vessels, not to bone vessels, not to pottery vessels. Okay, pottery vessels never are toivel in a mikveh. So but it's mysterious. Why should this halacha only apply to metal vessels? And number two, the Gemara says this halacha of tefillas kalim you buy from a Gentile only applies to klei su'uda, only applies to vessels that are used for food. Either vessels used to prepare food, vessels used for eating food, serving food. But garden tools, for example, don't require tefillah. Right? A shovel, a hoe, a rake doesn't require tefillah. Scissors, why not? Because if somehow, when a kli leaves the rishus Eved Kechavim and enters the rishus of Yisrael, so it's a step up and it requires tefillah, like a convert when he's mizgayer requires tefillah. What difference does it make? Why dafka klei suda? Why not Any vessel and any implement should require tefillah. So Rav Hirsch says an amazing explanation to explain these two halachas. Why tefillas kelim only applies to clay suda, why only to metal kelim? So like this. He says that metal kelim, as opposed to wood, as opposed to bone, metal kelim symbolize man's mastery of the world. They are the hardest to manufacture. First, the process of mining the metals is very difficult. The process of refining the metals is very difficult. The process of shaping the implement is very difficult. Metal vessels symbolize man's mastery of the world. Of course, to us, it seems trivial because we say, well, that was back in the Bronze Age, in the Iron Age. Now we live in the computer age. To us, perhaps the computer is the symbol of man's mastery and technological ability. But in the symbolism of the Torah, that's what metal kelim symbolize. That means that all of man's ingenuity, all of his ambition, all of his drive, all of his genius is devoted to the development and manufacture of these vessels. Now, what is eating? What does eating symbolize? Eating symbolizes the most basic, the most animalistic function of a human being. And it's one of the three things that the Gemara says a human being shares with animals, right? That he eats. So this is not one of the more noble aspects of a human being, right? A human being writes poetry. A human being thinks philosophical thoughts. Those are higher level activities. He eats. That's like what he shares in common with an animal. The metal kelim that are used for eating symbolize the idea of man's taking his ingenuity, his genius, his creativity, his strength, and using them as tools for satisfying his most animalistic urges. That's the idea of metal clay suda. And it's a very frightening thing. In other words, if a person, for example, makes metal tools for construction, so that's already something loftier. In other words, he uses his genius to create tools for making beautiful buildings, or works of art, or great pieces of literature, or maybe to make musical instruments. If a person makes a metal trumpet or a flute. There, man is using his genius for something loftier. But man using his genius, his creativity, his drive, his energy, for what? To eat better? To eat more efficiently? That instead of eating with his hands, he'll eat with a fork? But that's a very frightening thing. That's the idea of man using his loftiest talents for the lowliest ends. So, says Rav Hirsch, the idea of tefillas kelim is that it has to be sanctified. Now, this is the tikkun of achila. It says you are bringing kedusha into achila, into the realm of eating, by being toivel the kelim, sanctifying those kelim. You don't just make kelim and use them for food. Before you use them for food, you have to sanctify them. You have to be toivel them in a mikveh. You have to bring them into the realm of kedusha. Because just to take your human talents and direct them to improving the way in which you eat, that's something which is too horrible to contemplate. This is the idea that Rav Hirsch says, an amazing, powerful idea. And that's why it's dafka metal, that's why it's dafka clay suda. In Sifrei Chasidus, there's an idea. I'll give you one Mara Mokum that talks about it. but you find it in many, many places, that the Yetzer Hara of Arayas is rooted in the Yetzer Hara of Achila. If a person wants to conquer the taiva for Arayas, the battleground is the taiva of Achila. This is what's written in the Sefer Chasidus. Now, there are many remozim to this. One of them is this. Because we know that the chet of Adam and Chava in Gan Eden introduced the Yetzer Hara. Every aspect of the Yetzer Hara. But the one aspect which the Torah emphasizes is the Yetzer Hara of Arayas. This is the one aspect of the Yetzer Hara which the Torah emphasizes. It's before the chet, Vayiyu Shneim Arumim, V'lo Yizbeishashu. They were naked and not embarrassed. And after the chet, they were embarrassed. And Vayispru Alei Se'ena, they made clothes out of leaves to cover themselves. And the Mefarshim explain, what's the idea? The idea is like this, because until the chet, there was no part of their body that was used just for self-gratification, just to satisfy their desire. Therefore, there's no embarrassment. Just like we're not embarrassed to expose our hands, right? They weren't embarrassed to expose any part of their bodies. But after the chet, now there are parts of the body which man would use simply to gratify his own desire. That's a tremendously embarrassing thing. That there is a part of me which I use just to satisfy my lust. That's shameful. That has to be covered up. So, if you look in the Chumash, it's an interesting thing. This is the one thing that the Torah tells us explicitly changed as a consequence of the chet. So even though it's true that the chet introduced the Yetzer Hara and every aspect of the Yetzer Hara, but the one aspect which is mentioned explicitly is this difference, which is the Yetzer Hara for Arayas. And what caused it? Eating from the Eitz HaDas. In other words, the entryway was a downfall in the taiva of Achila. That Chava saw the fruit, that it was Tavil Einayim, it was good to eat, it looked good, it was tasty, and she ate it, and that brought the Yetzer Hara for Arayas. Rav Tzadok HaKayin wrote a kuntras on the idea of eating called Eis HaOichel, the time for eating. It's printed in the end of the Sefer Pri Tzadik and Sefer Breitowitz. And he says, this is Pshat in the Gemara. It's an amazing thing. He doesn't point out that Rashi learns different Pshat in the Gemara. There's a Gemara in Masechtas Brachos. Brings the famous mashal that says that imagine you have a young boy, and his father bathes him and anoints him with oil and feeds him and gives him to drink and hangs a pouch of coins around his neck, and he puts him in front of a house of immorality. What can that son do to prevent sinning? It's inevitable he'll sin. So the Gemara says that this mashal demonstrates the well-known proverb that Male Krise Zoni Bishi. If a person fills his belly, Zoni Bishi. What does Zoni Bishi mean? So Rashi says that the word Zoni means categories or types. Because he says that in Parshas Breishis, the word Liminehu, or Liminehem, the Targum is Lizinehain. So Zayin Nun, Zon, is the Aramaic of min, of species, or variety. And therefore it means that Male Krisi, you fill your belly, Zani Bishi, you open yourself to all sorts of varieties of bad things. That's how Rashi learns the Gemara. Rav Tzadok HaKayin understood, and it almost seems that he wasn't aware that there's another pshat in the Gemara, that Zani is Miloshen Znus. Zani is Miloshen Znus. It means promiscuity. Malay Kvisi, you fill your belly, then Zani Bishi. All sorts of bad promiscuity results. And Rabbi Tzadok says, and this is a remnant to this idea, that the Yetzer Hara of Arayas is rooted in the Yetzer Hara of Achila. If you can conquer the one, then you can deal with the other. If you can't deal with the one, then you're at risk for the other. That's what Rabbi Tzadok says. There could be, this is really the whole idea over here. This whole parsha, the whole parsha of Matos Bechlal, is really the battle of Klal Yisrael against Gilui Arayas. We point out in past years an amazing thing. There are 3 parshiyas that we always read during the 3 weeks, which are Matos, Masei, and Devarim. Some years, most years, Matos and Masei are a double parsha, and Pinchas is also read during the 3 weeks. But in a year like this, it isn't, because this is the special year we've talked about many times, where it was a leap year and Rosh Hashanah was on a Thursday, so there's an extra Shabbos in the winter. That's why we read Achrei Mos before Pesach and Naso before Shavuos, and now we have to get back on track. So the way we get back on track is we split Matos and Masei, and we read Pinchas before Shivas or B'Tammuz. And the 3 weeks are Matos, Masei, and Devarim. We pointed out in the past that if you look through these 3 weeks, you'll see that the theme of Matos is Gilui Arayas, and the theme of Masei is Shvichas Damim, and the theme of Devarim is Avodah Zarah. And these 3 parashas correspond to the 3 Averas, which were the initial cause of Churban. We won't go into it now, but we spoke about it a number of years ago. But this week's parsha is the parsha of Gilui Arayas, because the entire Mulchama of Midyan, which is really the theme of the parsha, right, is this question. It's the Nakama, it's the revenge against Midyan for having been machshalas in Gilui Arayas. And it's more than that. Because if you look in Parshas Pinchas, you see an amazing thing. And this is something that really we should devote a whole shiur in its own right. The initial command to wage war against Midyan is written in Parshas Pinchas. It's carried out in Parshas Matos. But the truth is that the command there in Parshas Pinchas and the command here in Parshas Matos are totally different. Here in Matos, it's expressed as a war of nekama, it's a war of revenge. Right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe Rabbeinu, Nekayim Nikmas B'nai Yisrael, and Moshe Rabbeinu tells the Jews, Nikmas Hashem b'Midyan, but it's a war of revenge. Revenge means retaliation for a past offense. If you look in Parashas Pinchas, it's totally different. It says, Tzroris Midyanim v'kisem oisam, fight them, ki tzorim heim lochem, because they are still out to get you. Tzorim is present tense. They are still out to get you, b'nichleihem, with their schemes, asher niklu, which they schemed once. The same schemes they schemed before, they're still scheming, they're still out to get you. They are still a threat. It's not retaliation for what they did to you once upon a time. They are still a threat. It's still a danger. You have to deal with them, because what they did then, they'll do again. And this kasha, maybe in future years, we'll deal with. That why in Parshas Pinchas is it put that way, as dealing with a current threat, and why in Parshas Matos is it explained as a war of nekama, of revenge, for something which happened in the past. It seems to be a little bit of a contradiction as what the nature of the mulchama is. But al kol panim, this is a mulchama against a nation who was machshalas in the area of Gilui Arayas. So this whole war is a war to, in a sense, promote and uphold the virtue of Klal Yisrael. And really, that's the resolution of the parsha. The resolution of the parsha was that the soldiers came back and they brought their kapara. Why? It says, of course, chas v'sholom, we weren't nichshol in the rayas itself, but maybe chas v'sholom, we were nichshol in the hearer avera. It also requires a kapara. So it's an amazing, amazing thing. That's why we have this parsha of Hechsher Kalim in the middle of this subject. It isn't just because they went to war, they had spoils and they had Kalim. Now the Ramban really asked as a question. This is not the first time that they waged war. Back in Parshas Chukas, you had the Mulchemes Sichem v'Oig. Nistam, they also captured Kalim. So why are the laws of capturing Kalim there? If it's only here because they waged war, so they came back with Kalim. How do you capture the Kalim? So the whole parsha could have been back there. The Ramban says the teretz, but the Ramban's teretz is really totally the machlekes Rishonim. The teretz is not pashut, the Ramban says. But I believe the reason this parsha is here is because if this parsha is the tikkun of Gilui Arayos, then the first thing that has to be addressed is the tikkun of achila. And that's what Tfilas Kalim is. Tfilas Kalim is bringing Kedusha into the realm of Achila, right? That, in other words, in a situation where really we debase ourselves because we devote our ingenuity and our creativity to manufacture vessels just to eat better, or to put it in modern metaphor, you go into a bookstore and you see, miles of shelves of cookbooks, right? So the whole creativity is devoted to eating better, right? Which is really the most animal-like function that we have. So to be machnas kedusha into the realm of achila, that's the idea of tfilas kalim. That is the aleph beis to dealing with the idea of Gilui Arayos, and that's why this parsha of tfilas kalim is dafka here. I just want to share with you one other thing, and I'm just going to mention it, and let you mull it over. There's an amazing mimer from the Ishbitzer in Parshas Noach. An amazing mimer in Parshas Noach. It says that when Noach sent out the Orev, he sent out the raven. So it says that the raven didn't go away. The raven went back and forth, came back, went away, and came back, went away. Yot v'shayiv, back and forth. Ad Yevaisha Samayim, until the water dried up. So the Ishbitzer says this pasuk is a remez to an amazing idea. It says the Orev, he says, symbolizes anger. It symbolizes anger. And Chazal tell us an amazing thing about the Orev. The Orev doesn't feed its own children. Right? The Orev, the raven doesn't feed its own children. Hashem feeds Livnei Orev Sheyikro. Hashem feeds the raven's children who call. But the raven doesn't feed its own children. Now imagine if we wouldn't feed our children, right? There'd be a lot of anger. Going back and forth. So he says the symbol of the Orev symbolizes the idea of anger. Water symbolizes the idea of taiva. And this is something which everyone knows. If you look in the Sefer Shara Kedusha, Reb Chaim Vital, who explains that there are 4 fundamental elements. There's Eish and Ruach and Mayim and Ofar, and all the Midas Ros come from these Yesoidos. He writes that Taiva comes from the Yesoid HaMayim. Because Mayim, it fosters growth, it makes luscious things. Those are things that we have Taiva for. So Taiva is the Yesoid HaMayim. He says like this. When it says that Noach sent by the Orev, it means that Noach wanted there should be no anger in the world. What do we need anger for? What do we need anger for? Let's get rid of it. Vaishalach is the Orev. What good is anger? We need to be angry? Get rid of anger. Hashem said, no, you need anger. Until all the water dries up, you need anger. So the Orev didn't go away. It came back and forth, till the water dried up. As long as there's taiva in the world, you need anger. This says Tzadok why. This says to the Ishbitzer why. He says, because sometimes the only way to deal with taiva is through anger. Now we know this is an amazing thing, that when a person gets angry, you lose your appetite. You ever have a situation you get so angry you don't want to eat? It's really true. The one thing that you can do to quell your taiva is find something to get angry about. You get angry, you don't want to eat, you don't want anything. There's no desire anymore. So it just says, it's an amazing thing, I'm just saying it over. He says that until Yavaisha Samayim, until all the taivas disappear, there's you need the orev, you need the anger. He says something amazing. He says in the Beis HaMikdash, the Mishnah Midah says they had something called an Amal Kalya Orev. It was like a metal plate that had spikes in it to chase away the orev, right? That they shouldn't rest on the roof of the Beis HaMikdash. So he says that symbolizes the idea that the Beis HaMikdash is the Makom Hatikun. This is the place where all the Midas Ros are Mesukan, right? So here, Dafka, we drive away anger. Because in the Beis HaMikdash, since we can cope with Taiva, because in the Beis HaMikdash we don't have a lust for material things, it's a spiritual realm, therefore there we don't need anger, there we can get rid of the Orev. But upon this is what Ishbitzer says. He says that anger is the way to cope with Taiva. I was thinking that maybe in defense of Moshe Rabbeinu, says they came back, and as we said from the Gemara and Shabbos, Rashi in the Gemara, Moshe Rabbeinu suspected that these people were nichshol in the tremendous taiva of arayas, not just hero avera, mamash gufo arayas. And Moshe Rabbeinu had to deal with them. How is he going to deal with these people who are so overcome with desire that they need to bring a carbon? And even like Ramban's pshat, we could conjecture, if they're bringing back the women alive, like why are they bringing back the women alive? Maybe because they had a desire to marry them. So how is Moshe Rabbeinu going to cope with them? So Moshe Rabbeinu got angry at them. Whereas it wasn't Moshe Rabbeinu flew off the handle. He lost it. Because Moshe Rabbeinu understood that if these people are menuga, if these people are afflicted with taiva, the only way to deal with that is to get them angry. Right? When you're angry, you lose your taiva. How do you get a person angry? If I want to get you to be angry, what's the best way? Get angry at you, you'll be angry at me. There's no better way than that, right? We all know that, right? To make someone angry, the best way is to be angry at him. So Moshe, right? In the hope that he could arouse their anger, it would give them a moment of clarity that they would forget their taiva. So it's just a conjecture, just a thought that maybe in defense of Moshe Rabbeinu, it isn't as we assume that he flew off the handle, he lost it. Even his anger was calculated. But of course, as we said, it was a mistake, right? Because they weren't guilty, chas v'shalom, of Gilei Arayos. They suspected maybe they'd committed a hero avera, and that's why they wanted to bring a carbon. So it's almost, in a sense, the exact opposite of Chazal. Chazal say, "Kivin shegiel lechlal kas, shegiel lechlal tos." Okay, that's true regarding the parsha of Hechsher Kalim, but it's also Kivin shegiel lechlal tos, hechiel legal kas, because he made a mistake in jumping to conclusions about them, and that's why he got angry. So there's also a connection. If you make a mistake and never get angry, so the result of the anger is to make another mistake. In other words, a mistake is a mistake. Here's some thoughts on the parsha. The Rosh should give us the siyat d'shmaya that we should be misgaber on this terrible nisayon of arayas, and that'll be the tikkun of the first third. Rather than the next 2 weeks, we'll work on the next two.